Hello everyone, in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to beat the von Hennig Gambit with the black pieces. You've probably seen this gambit before, you may or may not know that it is called the von Hennig. I think there's quite a few gambits named after von Hennig actually. As you can see on the screen down below me, I have a list of things that I think you should always keep in mind when facing this gambit. I'm going to take you through some of the main lines, some of the ideas, and then I'm going to run you through 3 sampled games, one of them played by me, 2 of them played by other high-rated players, and use those to demonstrate the application of these ideas. So, the von Hennig Gambit starts after e4, c6, d4, d5, knight to c3. You can get to it in different move orders, but this is the most common. And after taking, white does not take back, but instead goes bishop to c4. This pawn is still hanging, of course, and white will potentially, most likely, win it back. But white immediately puts pressure on f7 and intends to play f3 to gambit the pawn fully for quicker development. Now, if you are new to my channel, you will not be aware that I made a video probably yesterday on beating the alien gambit. And those of you who have already watched that video are going to have a good head start here, because in the alien gambit, which is this move order, I'm essentially recommending a very similar setup. And the reason I'm doing that is, one, because it's just a good setup, right? We're looking at moves like bishop f5, e6, knight d7, knight bd7. But also because it makes it far easier to remember. So, bishop c4. We're going to go bishop to f5. You can start with knight to f6 as well. It doesn't really matter whether you prefer bishop f5 or knight to f6. And white will almost always play the move f3 here. The intention is to get you to take, white will take back. And believe it or not, white has over 60% win rate in this position. And like 6 moves in, that's pretty insane. And this is really, really difficult to defend. There's traps like bishop to g4, which gets played over 34% of the time. And this just blunders immediately a piece. Well, no, sorry. Black doesn't lose a piece, but black loses a pawn, and the king can no longer castle. And this is obviously a miserable position for black to try to defend. That's one of the many, many traps that the von Hennig has. Therefore, after the move f3, we're not going to take. We are instead going to play bishop to f5. And as you can see in the text below me, basically never take on f3. The only time I want you to take on f3 is if white is actually threatening to take this pawn. So let's say in this position, white plays queen e2. Here, I'd love to play a move like e6 and go for the normal setup. But here, you can't allow it, because white will take and white will crash through the center in some manner, and you're going to have a very tough time. So if this were to be played, for example, then you do have to take on f3, and then you can continue doing what we're going to do. However, the main line, f3, no, we're not taking, bishop to f5. And white has several options. The most common move is taking on e4, because white wants to free up the f3 square for the knight, and he wants to castle with an open f-file for the rook. We, of course, are going to take back, and now we are up a clean pawn. We're up a clean pawn. By the way, apologies for the lighting and the weird background. I'm in a different filming location right now. We're up a clean pawn, and white has superior development, yes. We need to secure our pawn, make sure well, we've already secured the pawn. We just need to make sure our king is safe, basically. So, there's lots of different things white can do here. White could take, in which case we can take back. And I think one of the example games follows this sort of line. Knight f3, we're going to go e6. If white were to castle, for example, we just go bishop b7. We're preparing to castle, and we're going to be absolutely fine. This bishop can come to f6. The knight can come to b6 and into d5. That's a very common maneuver, or via f6. If you've watched the Alien Gambit video, you'll know the knight coming to d5 is very, very useful to block this bishop's scope. And at some point, if you want, you can also drop this bishop back to d5 to offer a trade. However, be aware that the bishop could just drop back to d3 and potentially be even more problematic. So better is probably to keep your light squared bishop on this important diagonal defending h7. White doesn't tend to take, though. Knight f3 is the most common move, and I should have actually included in the text, really. Basically never take on c3 either. Taking on c3 is not great, because white takes back. We have one piece developed. White is ready to castle, and he's going to chuck the knight on e5, and we can probably defend this position, but honestly, the open b-file only really benefits white, and the pawn coming to c3, kind of with tempo, because we took white and white took back, only helps to secure the white center. We really don't gain anything from that, so don't take on c3. If knight to f3, what I'm going to recommend is the move knight to d6. By doing this, we avoid the trade of knights, we drop the knight back with tempo on the bishop. And the reason I'm recommending knight d6 is because this is a very, very common move in several lines. So I think that if I recommend it in several lines, it makes it far easier to remember this idea. Because, like, you know, the most common moves here are taking and playing e6. And e6 is fine, but the bishop can get a little bit stranded on the e4 square potentially, right? So don't take. Don't go e6. I mean, you can play e6. It's kind of up to a stylistic choice, to be honest. But I think knight d6 is really good, because not only does it attack the bishop, it defends your bishop and defends f7. And white isn't necessarily going to play all the same, like, theoretical moves every game. People may have their own pet lines that they like. And knight d6 is great because it avoids so many traps. And as I say in the text wall below, always calculate bishop takes f7 check, because it's a big problem sometimes, as I will demonstrate in some of the other lines. With the knight on d6, bishop takes f7 check never really works. Never really works. But okay, after knight d6, something like bishop to b3, then we just continue. e6, bishop e7, castles, knight d7. We have a very comfortable game. Again, for the, like, to show you the practicality of these lines, I am going through 3 example games later in the video, so make sure you stick around for that. And if you're enjoying so far, please drop a like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Okay, so I think, like, you know, something like castles here, bishop e7, knight e5 is a very common move. You can go bishop to g6. You can go knight to d7. I personally recommend knight d7 to challenge this knight as soon as possible. And black has very good scores in this position, up a full pawn. Also, d4 is quite weak, because with the knight on c3, white can't play c3 himself, so this pawn can become weak sometimes. You could potentially challenge it with c5, but make sure you calculate that before you play it. So, f3. What do we play? We don't take, we go knight to f6. If takes, we take. If take, we take. If knight f3, we go knight d6. Okay? Cool. Now, white doesn't have to go knight to f3 here. It is the most common move. White also doesn't have to take on e4. It looks like some people actually do play bishop takes f7. And after king takes f7, go queen to f3, pinning the bishop to the knight. Sorry, the bishop to the king. And this is where the previous idea also comes in very useful. Knight d6. And some of these lines actually transpose, because the exact same line, I believe, happens after queen to f3, knight to d6, bishop takes f7 check, which looks like it can't be played. But if you take with the knight, your bishop hangs, and I think white restores material equality. So you have to take with the king. And after g4, you can play e6. You can't save the bishop. But e5 is a very aggressive way of trying to fight back. If you play the move e6, that's fine. The point is that you open up this diagonal for the queen, and you try to counterattack white. So if white takes the bishop, for example, you throw in this check first. If the queen blocks, then you can take, and probably... Okay, apparently e takes is better, but knight takes is also fine. and you maintain your pawn up advantage, and this 3v1 should be decisive at some point. But the vast majority of people just move the king, and then you can go ahead and take on f5, and you're perfectly fine. Again, you're up a pawn still. Your king is a bit stranded, but so is the white king. So again, always be aware of bishop takes f7, but if it gets played, it doesn't mean you've lost. It does not mean you've lost. It is a full piece, remember. If you have to give a piece back, but you win a pawn in the process, you're still up a pawn. And this queen to h4 idea is very common because, again, the f pawn has exited the game. So this diagonal is weak. And yeah, so it's interesting how the positions can transpose like that. Like, you can take on f7 immediately, or you can throw in queen to f3 first. Again, knight d6, defending, and attacking. Well, attacking c4 and defending the other two. Most people drop the bishop back to b3, though, and the move should be very obvious. e6, again, just go for the setup. Go for the setup. It's really, really solid. Don't mess around with it unless there is, like, really good cause. Again, obviously make your own decisions during your own games. This is a great setup. Bishop e7, knight d7, castle when appropriate. So, like, the most common move in this position, knight g to e2. The computer does like throwing in this check, but I don't think it's necessary. Just go knight d7. Castles. You can play knight to f6. You can go bishop to e7. g4 will sometimes be played. Just drop the bishop back. This bishop is very good. One of the good things about knight to d6 as well, kicking the bishop back to b3, is that white struggles to play the move bishop to d3 himself to actually challenge your bishop, which is doing excellent defensive duties, and f7 is still defended by the knight. Something like knight f4 going after your bishop, it's fine. If white takes, just take back. You're fine. You're still up a pawn. These pawns aren't all scary, and you will see in a couple of the games that I'm going to show you, white will often try to storm the king side with pawns, but black can generate a lot of counterplay. Bishop to g5 is also a very common idea to trade off the bishops and get your queen over to the king side. Am I missing anything? Let's see. So here, yes, okay, there are other lines white can go for. White will not necessarily take. Bishop g5 is quite a common move, for example. Don't panic. Don't take on f3. Just develop your knight. If white takes, just take. This pawn is defended. Don't take unless you absolutely have to. Now, one of the most common moves in this position is queen to e2. Now, pay attention, because the queen on e2 does threaten to win this pawn, so we do have to do something about it. Now, the computer recommends moves like knight b6, and that's fine. It also likes queen a5 pinning the knight, which is also fine. But I think far simpler is just taking on f3. We've been forced to take on f3, so we'll just do it. Now, however, we play the move e6, and our position is far more developed than it was previously if we had taken on f3 unprovoked. Because here, e6 is well defended, our bishop's ready to develop to e7 to break the pin. We also have control over the e5 square, which is quite useful. Now, of course, you can't take just yet, because after de5, there's a lot of pressure on the knight, and you have to go for some very complicated lines here that I don't think are necessary. Just go bishop e7. This knight's going nowhere. The knight is going nowhere. Technically, the knight can take on f7, which is worth noting. However, this is defendable, because you can go for knight b6, knight d5, shutting off this diagonal, and you'll be fine from that position. But again, taking on f7, whether the bishop or the knight, you need to be aware of. You could play h6 here, actually, which is probably a bit more, a bit safer. And if the bishop drops back again, bishop e7. If the knight takes on f7, we're fine. If castle's kingside, again, just knight b6, get the knight to d5, block this diagonal off, there will be nothing. The rook technically can take here, because the pawn is pinned to the king, but we have counterplay. We have good counterplay, and everything in the white position is hanging here. So white has to be careful of counterattacks. Don't be scared to counterattack in the von Hennig. Don't be scared. the white king is often exposed, whether from this diagonal when it's on e1 or this diagonal when it is on g1, okay? Am I missing anything? Am I missing anything? Yes, I am. Okay, so g4 is also a move here, which is relatively common. No, not taking. g4, going after the bishop. Just drop the bishop back. Drop it back. This pawn is still defended. Now, if g5, now your knight is going to have to move. And white can forcibly win the pawn back for the time being. So, after knight to d5, we're attacking this knight. We're not really going to take it unless there's a really good reason to. But white here does have an opportunity to win his pawn back. Now, he can't really take with the f-pawn, because we'll take on c3 and take on e4. And knight to f3 means the rook isn't trapped, but we have very good play here. This is a relatively comfortable position, I think. We can go bishop d5, we can go e6. The white king is very exposed. We can counterattack very easily. The knight could take, and here obviously we can't win the pawn back. But look how overextended the white pawns are. This knight also doesn't have a good square to develop to. Here, again, I would just say go e6. Go e6. Bring the knight to d7. This bishop probably is going to go to e7. And we're cool. Throw in b5 if you want. Sometimes that is a move. But from here, you can just play chess, right? White has weaknesses. Try to exploit them. You should have a fine time from this position. Okay, that's all the main lines covered from here. After takes, yeah, knight takes. This is all pretty standard. We've covered everything from this position. After knight e4, bishop e4, knight f3, yeah, we covered this position as well. Again, e6. Just go for the setup. Go for the setup. You will be fine. Let's jump into the 3 example games, and I'll show you these ideas put into practice. So the first one is my own game, which I think I played maybe a couple of weeks ago. So we get a von Hennig, right? I go knight to f6, defending the pawn, f3, and I go bishop to f5. You can technically go for moves like b5. Again, you can take, but I do not want you to risk that kind of thing. Bishop f5 scores incredibly well for a reason. Bishop f5. My opponent went g4. I dropped my bishop back, and he went h4. So a slightly different move order to what we had in the analysis, but the idea is exactly the same. White could have gone for the immediate g5. Instead, h4 and h5 were thrown in first, right? But it's fine. We put the knight on d5, and my opponent now has to make a choice. He takes on e4 with the pawn. As we discussed before, if he takes with the knight, I can't get the pawn back immediately, but I can make normal developing moves. The white king is very exposed. That's not really a secret. And if the white king goes queenside, which by the way will take a while because he still has development to do, we can throw pawns forward very quickly. Our bishops are already set up for an attack as well, and our knight is very well situated in the center of the board. It's always a mistake for white to take here. You can see the evaluation bar go straight into our favor to like -2 territory because white loses one of his best pieces. He has no counterpart for our light squared bishop, and this is a ridiculously comfortable position. So the knight is great on d5 because it's pretty much untouchable as well. So my opponent takes with the f-pawn. I take on c3 and I win a pawn on e4. He moves his rook. He should have developed his knight. However, it does look like I've got good pressure on the knight. So he moves his rook. I go bishop to d5. Not the most accurate move, but I offer a trade of bishops. My opponent, of course, declines the trade of bishops. And as I said before, it can be dangerous to go for this sort of maneuver with the bishops dancing backwards and forwards because h7 can be quite weak. However, this position is slightly different because I can play the move g6, preparing a really nice developing square for my bishop. And because these pawns are already committed to g5 and h4, the king side is completely locked up, so I don't have to be concerned about white making a pawn break on the king side. So, of course, there are exceptions to every rule. The rule, of course, being, oh, this bishop is scary on this diagonal, but in this case, no, it's not really. because I don't have a pawn on h7 and my pawns are very secure on the light squares. So think for yourself. Bishop g7, bishop to f4, castle, rook to f2, knight to d7. I don't go for the e6 bishop to e7 line that I would normally go for, but that's mainly because this pawn is in the way. Why would my bishop go to e7, right? This is an exception. Queen e2, queen a5, and in this position, my opponent trying to defend his c3 pawn plays the move king to d2. I take on f3, queen takes f3, bishop takes d4. This is hit, this can't be taken because of the pin, and my opponent resigns. Of course, this wasn't a typical von Hennig by any means, but I think the setup that I'm recommending gets you those sort of non-typical setups that white doesn't want. And if white tries to carry on attacking, which is effectively what my opponent did this game, he tried his best to keep attacking me, get his pieces to aggressive squares, but there was nothing. And he ended up neglecting his own king safety and losing as a result of it. Next game. Hopefully these are useful for you, by the way. If you have any questions, any comments on the opening whatsoever, you think I'm missing something, drop it down in the comments. I will reply to you. Okay, in this game, it's quite interesting because the game starts as an Indian defense and transposes into a Chigorin and then goes into a Black Mardima Gambit. But the resulting position is exactly the same. This game is actually from 1988, from a correspondence game from 223 2400 rated players. I seem to recognize the name of the black player, Frank Zeller. Anyway, bishop c4. We have a von Hennig, again, different move order, but that's not the point because we get to the same position. Bishop to f5 defending, fe4, knight e4, knight to f3. This is, of course, one of the lines we went over in the analysis. Black goes e6, blocking off this diagonal. White castles, and bishop to e7 is played. Again, knight d6 is a very good move. You could even play it in this position, and I do recommend knight to d6. But if you want to go with e6, and you can't play knight to d6 in every single line anyway, so it's good to know both. But be aware, knight d6 is a move, but this whole e6, bishop e7, knight d7 setup is also very good. White takes on e4 here. Bishop takes e4. Queen e2. The bishop goes back to f5. As I said, it tends to be quite a good idea to keep this bishop over on the king side. Personally, I would put the bishop on g6, but perhaps white was concerned about the knight coming to e5. Not yet, because d4 hangs, but something like, I don't know, c3 castles knight e5, that is a little bit uncomfortable, but you have knight d7 taking away the e5 square from the knight, so be aware of that. His opponent does go c3, knight d7 is played. I kind of predicted the future there, that was not intended. Bishop to f4, just developing the bishop to a normal square, castles, and if you take like a still image of this position, I mean, chess positions are still, but you get my point. If we pause here, black is up a pawn. White doesn't have a whole lot of compensation to show for it. He has good control over e5, and that's about it. For a whole pawn, that is not worth it. Rook goes to e1, and black starts fighting back on the queen side. There's no correct way to go about this. Black chooses to fight on the queen side here. Bishop to b3. And b4. b4 wasn't the most accurate move because it allows the move c4. And the black pawn's a little bit like in a strange position. The white center is very strong here. Better is apparently a move like a6 preparing c5, which it kind of looks like a Slav sort of approach. But okay. White goes for knight e5. The knight takes on e5. Again, very common idea in this opening. The bishop takes on e5. Pawn is c3. Pawn c3, and bishop to h4. A strange looking move. White goes g3, and the bishop goes back to e7. White induces a weakness. h4. As I said before, this kingside pawn storm is a very common tactic used by white in these von Hennig positions. h6. g4. Bishop goes back to h7, and h4. A strange move, to be honest. Sorry, h5 even. I don't really understand that move. I thought that g5 looked way more natural, Although I suppose takes, and white kind of runs out of firepower. Apparently, white has to move queen g4, though. And of course, you can't take because of mate. However, white goes h5. Black offers a bishop trade. The queen goes to c4. Bishop takes, rook takes, and queen to h4. As I said, this diagonal can be used for counterplay in many positions for black. And the game goes on. Black secures a queen trade. Black is still up a pawn, and the white pawns end up being pretty weak in the center of the board. Black goes on to win this game in very nice fashion in the endgame. 2 on the king side for black, 1 on the queen side for white. This is just a winning endgame for black, because if this pawn was over on the king side, it's probably drawn. But here, the connected pass pawns are too much for white to deal with. The game goes on, and in this position, white resigns. Last game I'm going to take you through. This does go from a normal Caro Kann von Hennig Gambit, and this is a blitz game played on lead chess between two 2200 rated players. So, you know, very good chess players. f3, bishop to f5, defending the pawn. F takes e4, knight takes e4, and knight to f3. Again, this is one of the most common positions you're going to get. e6, going for the setup. Castles, again, you can go for this knight d6 line, and I think it is very good. You could even... Well, after castles, you could still go knight to d6, to be honest, and I think it's probably quite a good move. So, personally, I would recommend it. Oh, that's exactly what he does. Alright, whatever. Of course, if the bishop goes to d3, which it doesn't here, the computer likes developing the knight, but I say just take it. Just don't create any complications. Just take it. Bishop e7, knight d7, maybe bishop f6, castles. You're very happy here. Bishop e7 immediately. The bishop goes to b3. Knight to e5. Castles. Now, again, if the knight comes to e5, challenge it immediately. Don't let any shenanigans happen. Just challenge it. If the knight takes, fantastic. If the queen defends the knight, then just take it. Just take it. Now, you will have to put your knight on c8 here, which looks uncomfortable. But you can reroute via b6 into d5, which, like I said, is one of the squares the knight wants to go to. Although I can see why black didn't take, because, yeah, the knight does get kicked back to c8 and it looks uncomfortable. However, g4 is played by white. This is just a very common move. I mean, there's loads of things white can do here, but g4 is so common. He goes for it, and it's just not that good. Bishop g6, knight takes g6, h takes g6. As I said in the analysis, this trade is fine. This trade is fine. Queen e2, bishop g5. As I mentioned in the analysis, this is a very common idea to get the bishops traded, because black is up a pawn. Black is up a pawn. Knight goes to e4. Bishop c1. Rook c1. Knight e4. Queen e4. Black is still up a pawn. Queen to g5. Not the most accurate move, because apparently there's problems here. With like take. If the king goes to h7. Rook f8. Black can take back, but the position is very, very messy. So yeah, just something to be aware of. But, you know, it is an obscure looking tactic, to be fair. Rook goes to d1. The knight goes to d7. The queen goes back to g2. Now I don't think this tactic works, because after queen takes, king h7, you can't take the rook because it's defended twice. And if you take the knight, there's queen e3, king h1, queen e4, king moves again. I'm not sure what the plan is. Just rook a8, apparently. I suppose the white king is far weaker than the black king, because these pawns are actually quite good defenders. But anyway, queen goes back to g2, knight goes to f6. And as I said before, if you can strand the bishop on the b3 square, it does become a little bit ineffective. White may have to go for a pawn break like this to make it worth something. h3, rook goes to d8, c3, knight goes into d5. Not the best move, but it's fine. Rook e1. And from here, black goes on to convert very nicely up an exchange. And, I mean, this has no relation to the opening, of course, so I won't spend ages on it, but white ends up hanging a queen. Hopefully, this video has shown you how to play against the von Hennig Gambit. If you think that I am missing anything, Again, please let me know in the comments. I again apologize for the camera lighting in this video, but hopefully that did not take away from the chess being shown. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out this video up here showing how to beat the Alien Gambit, which is another one you need to know if you play the Caro Kann. And if you want to see me playing the Caro Kann live in, normal games, check out the playlist down here for all the games on my channel in the Caro Kann. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.